Hello everyone, and welcome to the anchor session of CME Palooza Fall. This is our afternoon snack session sponsored by Haymarket Medical Education. I am Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and I would like to welcome you to this session entitled Learning Progression Over Time in Narcolepsy, the Impact of Environmental Changes and How We Evaluate Behavior. Our moderator for this session is Jackie Brooks. Jackie is Vice President of Medical Strategy at Haymarket Medical Education, and she will be introducing the rest of the panel here momentarily. But before she does, as with all of our CME Palooza sessions, I'd first like to thank our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Haymarket Medical Education, Med Learning Group, Platform Q Health Education, Academic CME, the Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning, Antidote Education Company, Clinical Education Alliance, Daiichi Sankyo, DKB Med, Helio CME, Integrity Continuing Education, Medscape Education, Projects and Knowledge, and Talem Health. Finally, our bronze sponsors, Answers in CME, AxDev, Bonum Continuing Education, Catalyst Medical Education, CMEology, Excalibur Medical Education, Global Education Group, Goodwin Group, Infograph Ed, Integritas Communications, Iridium Continuing Education, Leading Learning, MedIQ, Partners for Advancing Continuing Education, Paradigm Medical Communications, Primed, QDCME, PVI, Research to Practice, Touch IME, Vindigo Medical Education, and Right Medicine. I'm going to be repeating that in my sleep tonight. So here's how to ask questions during this session. You can use the Horizon CME text line to send in a question, the number 267-666-0CME, that's 0263. Or if you're watching this in YouTube, you can enter in questions within the YouTube chat function. Hopefully there'll be lots of questions during this session, and we will get to as many as we can. We've got a few ARS questions using Poll Everywhere right at the start of this session. So if you can have your phones or devices ready, we will get to those ARS questions here momentarily. Finally, please note that the opinions, discussions, and/or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or position of their employer, its parent company, or their affiliates. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Jackie to get us started.
So hi, everybody. I'll introduce myself in a little while, but I just want to explain to you the title of the program. We really wanted to see whether a meta-analysis of narcolepsy education that we had conducted year on year would show that we had actually impacted knowledge and competence. And then when we talk about behavior, we actually wanted to see whether that knowledge and competence correlated in some way with behavior change using our actual claims database. And so we'd be excited to show you some of those data in a little bit. The other thing is, to talk about how environmental changes impact learning. And what I mean by that is talking about the changes in the narcolepsy landscape, such as new data for new medications, new approvals of medications, new guideline documents, and how they could actually impact how learners actually learn and the trends that we see among the learner population. So as we introduce the group, I just want to, first of all, say thank you so much to Dr. Anne-Marie Morse. I'll ask her to introduce herself in a little bit. Anne has been really incredible in helping us to understand the landscape in sleep disorders sort of within narcolepsy and outside, and she's become an incredible partner for us, and I value her input all the time. So I just wanted to thank her for participating in this program with us. And so, and we'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you for the very kind summary of my participation. It might be overestimated. So my name is Anne-Marie Morris. I am the Director of Child Neurology and Pediatric Sleep Medicine at Geisinger Genoese Children's Hospital. Don't let my titles fool you. I am a neurologist with special qualifications in child neurology, and my specific area of expertise is within central disorders of hypersomnolence, like narcolepsy. One of the things that I do want to whet your appetite with as we're getting ready to unpack some really interesting data is to give you just some background around narcolepsy. It's a rare disease affecting about 1 in 2,000 people. And even as a sleep specialist, I very frequently am unfortunately disappointed by the lack of knowledge and awareness. This has been clearly represented in peer-reviewed published literature that this is a major knowledge gap and a need for continuing medical education that is impactful. When you look at the 2014 survey, Awaken survey, which looked at the awareness and knowledge of narcolepsy, it actually asked sleep physicians as well as primary care physicians about their ability to recognize symptoms of narcolepsy and then be able to actually characterize what that pentat is. As a sleep physician, they very frequently were overconfident, about 42% saying that they were able to characterize what the symptoms of narcolepsy are. But when put to task, only 22% were able to perform. Unfortunately, primary carers were only 7%. So this really underscores the relevant need for being able to provide that education, but then to be able to generate data like this that helps to understand how it not only impacts knowledge and awareness, but also potentially clinical practice.
So Emily, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Emily Bixler. I'm the Director of Outcomes, Assessments, and Evaluations here at Haymarket Medical Education. Really excited to be able to dive into some of this data with you guys.
Leanne?
All right, and I'm Leanne Berger. I'm a data analyst here at Haymarket in the Outcomes Department.
And finally, I'm Jackie Brooks. I'm actually one of the vice presidents of medical strategy at Haymarket. I am actually a psychiatrist by training and have worked in the sleep space for many, many years. So it's really been an area of huge interest to me. You know, it's fascinating that so many of these disorders are rare and that, you know, the space still needs so much education. And as Anne alluded to earlier, there are really so many gaps in the space that education, I think, can address.
Diving into some of these polling questions, as Scott had mentioned earlier, please use your poll everywhere here.
So I think these types of polling questions are always really important for us to be able to understand who the audience is, but this actually is underscoring the critical importance of, if you're doing CME, what is your goal and how are you actually constructing what we're doing? Some of the things that's been really excited in being able to work with Haymarket Media and partnering with Jackie and some of our education is really looking at not only our serial learning, but also the development of multimodal learning to really try to get at the point of how can we further reinforce what it is that you're learning.
Yeah. And I'm looking at these data and I'm seeing that, you know, most people feel that they're pretty uncomfortable with using, or that they haven't really had the opportunity to use meta-analyses to gauge serial learning. And I mean, this is something that Emily and I were talking about earlier, which is, you know, we have so many outcomes reports that we have to get out of the door in a timely fashion on an annual basis. And, you know, Emily, can you estimate how many you actually get out of the door for us on an annual basis? Do you know?
It's over 100.
Right. So, you know, when you're doing that many outcomes reports on an annual basis, I mean, this kind of analysis is really pretty daunting and time consuming. And, you know, we don't have the luxury of doing them all the time. But as we move into 2025, I think we are going to be offering some of these on a more limited basis. So, you know, hopefully we can, you know, talk a little bit about that some more at the end of this session. So the next question is, how likely are you to use real world data in assessing your learners for serial learning, the impact of serial learning? So, you know, traditionally, and I've been in this industry for a very long time, I think that claims data have been an incredibly expensive consideration when it comes to any educational program. I'm interested to hear from the rest of you whether anybody's seeing that change or whether that is actually impacting sort of how much access you have to claims data.
Well, one of the things I would say is from a clinical side, very frequently we're using claims data to get a lay of the land of understanding what are patterns and trends. Because as we see different factors that can contribute to how people are being diagnosed or treated or what potential prognostic factors are, Real world data really can be quite informative. Of course, it's not an exact science, and many times is leading to correlative findings, but sometimes can help in giving directionality in regards to what we might need to look at to better understand the causative relationships.
Absolutely. Okay, so Leanne, you're up.
All right, we're diving in. Okay, so first we wanted to start off by giving some background about how we went about conducting this meta-analysis. We looked at 7 activities, web-based activities in narcolepsy spanning from 2022 to 2024. And for all the pre-post questions within each activity, we had our medical team assign a tag according to the focus of that particular question. These tags were meant to be broad clinical topics that would allow us to uncover themes with regards to how well learners really understood the content. We presented the results either as overall data per topic across all years to demonstrate general trends, or divided up by year so that we could note any differences year over year and ultimately delve into factors that could have contributed to these differences. It's important to note here that we did not have sufficient to present every topic, and therefore not every single pre-post question is represented. The topics included in this analysis are only ones where we had a large enough sample size. The overall data presented consists of sleep medicine learners, meaning anyone who engaged in activities with professions and specialties directly related to sleep medicine. This includes professions such as physicians, NPs, and PAs, as well as specialties such as sleep medicine, neurology, psychiatry, internal medicine, and family medicine. These are the clinicians that are most involved in the care of patients with sleep disorders and ultimately the focus of our analysis. Within the sleep medicine learner group, we then compared data from 2 different cohorts. We looked at those who participated in 1 activity and then those who participated in 2 or more activities. The purpose of this analysis was to identify any differences between the 2 groups and determine if repetition or serial learning would in fact lead to better learning outcomes. And lastly, we looked at claims data. In order to comprehend the impact of our education, we assessed performance by using real-world claims data. We analyzed whether sleep medicine learners changed the frequency of their narcolepsy diagnosis or narcolepsy prescriptions between pre- and post-activity timeframes. We pulled this data 4 months prior to engaging that activity, and then again 4 months after the activity. All right, and next slide, please. Thank you. So just to recap here, the analysis focuses on the 2022 to 2024 timeframe, which included 7 web-based narcolepsy activities. In total, we had 4,329 learners, and of those, 1,773 were sleep medicine learners. 331 of the sleep medicine learners were repeat learners and participated in 2 or more of our activities.
I just want to quickly make a comment here because it's just occurred to me. If you think those numbers are low, just keep in mind that some of those activities are still active in 2024 and may have just been released relatively recently. So, what we do is on a monthly basis, as every CME company would, we track how many learners are participating in these activities and ensuring that we reach our guarantees.
All right, so looking at the narcolepsy landscape, we really wanted to see how the environmental changes in narcolepsy would impact learning. So we're going to dive into that next. This first slide, what you're looking at here is the average of all the baseline data and the average of all the post-assessment data from every question within the time frame of those 7 programs. So as Leanne had mentioned, our medical team had grouped the questions together to generate these themes. She also mentioned earlier, we narrowed them down to these 4 based on our sample sizes. But we're looking here specifically at our intended audience of sleep learners, and we saw improvements across each theme, which luckily is what we had expected. It's always nice to see when your hypotheses are accurate. But particularly, we saw improvements in treatment efficacy and safety, treatment strategy, and guidance. Based on those improvements we see in diagnosis, we suspect that maybe with a larger amount of questions, we might have had a significant increase there as well if we had a larger sample size to include that.
So I want to,
do you want to expand on that one?
Yeah, I'll expand on that one. We'll show you in a minute, actually, and Anne will talk through that, how really what happened in between, I would say, like early 2000 and 2024, or maybe just before 2020, not 2000. What happened around 2020 was that suddenly we saw a slew of new drugs coming out into the market and being approved. And, so the emphasis on diagnosis was kind of lessened by comparison to making people more aware of the treatment approaches. And, the data that we're presenting here is not only based on, input or on funding from one supporter, but from multiple supporters. And so we were really focused on the treatment landscape at the time. We did want to include diagnosis because we do have some claims data related to diagnosis, and we did want to show you that we did see a trend improvement. But again, not all of those activities cover diagnosis.
All right, so the next slide is kind of looking at the year-by-year comparison of those same themes that you saw on the previous slide, excluding diagnostics, of course, because we don't have the sample size for it to do a year-by-year comparison on that theme. But what we see here is that while each year showed the activities had achieved their goal of significantly increasing learners' knowledge and competence in these three areas, we also saw a very sharp dip in 2023 pre-test, so the baseline along all three of those themes. So to explain this, we really wanted to look at the narcolepsy environment in terms of, the emerging drugs, the guidelines surrounding this time frame. So that really leads us into the next slide.
So Anne, you're the best person
Love the experts here to chime in.
So when you're looking at the prior slide, the prior several slides, I think some of the things to really highlight is, one, there is a challenge in identifying individuals who have this condition. Although there are a very clear delineation of what the clinical symptom spectrum should look like, and if you would reflect on some of the data that is available of how frequently are these patients showing up in a sleep clinic, in 2005, Dr. Naresh Punjabi had published that about 20% of patients being referred to a sleep clinic are being referred for excessive daytime sleepiness, namely the exclusion of narcolepsy and idiopathic hypersomnia. When you look at the landscape of how many of those are actually ending up being diagnosed, narcolepsy still was the second most common diagnosis in a sleep clinic, representing about 5% of those being diagnosed in a sleep clinic. Now, with that stated, you would think that that would be the demand of people having a lot of knowledge and awareness of this. However, when you do have a rapidly changing landscape of not only the changes in a diagnostic statistical manual to achieve diagnosis, the availability in 2019 through Mayo Clinic to now have a CSF test or a spinal fluid test. But then, as you can see by this changing landscape in medical therapies that are available, it creates a dynamic of questioning, how do I diagnose? And more specifically, I have this patient I've been taking care of, which is the right therapy? You'll see that in 2021, you would expect that this should have provided great guidance. We have now the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and European guidelines for treatment. However, this introduced only further complexity. The reason why is when you looked at the two differing guidelines, they were structurally radically different and even had evaluations that differed in terms of their preference in treatments. When you looked at the American guidelines, they really are giving you a suggestion of how strong is the data to support the use of this medication. When you compare it to the European guidelines, they're actually quite prescriptive in saying, if you have this symptom profile, this is what you should utilize. And this is your first line, your second line, and your third line. So you can imagine with such a robustly evolving landscape in a disease state that has a very wide phenotype, and now with you having all these other changes and guidances that are really conflicting to one another, it introduces opportunity for not only education, but clearly a dip in terms of what people's comfort and knowledge were entering into some of these activities.
Yeah, and I think, Anne, it's, I mean, it's on the slide, but it's notable that, in the first, 1998, we saw the approval of the first drug that was actually for excessive sleepiness in narcolepsy. And then, there were a few things that happened between then and like 2007, but then we had this huge break, of like 12 years where nothing happened. And then suddenly we saw all these approvals. So you're getting new data for these drugs, you're getting new approvals. And obviously, in my mind, it's going to cause a lot of confusion in the landscape.
Yes.
And, I think we saw that I think you saw that just clinically, right? Because you saw the differences in the referrals and the questions you were being asked, but we also see it in the data. So if we look at the next slide, again, we're seeing those interesting baseline dips in 2023 and 2024 related to efficacy and safety. We're seeing the same thing in 2023 related to to treatment strategy. And what I meant by treatment strategy, kind of when we categorize these, is like really personalizing treatment, thinking about how you manage a patient, so more of a competence-based question series. And then finally, in guidance, we saw sort of low baselines really, when it came to 2022 and 2023. And so if we overlay that, Scott, if you could advance to the next slide, please. If we overlay that, the things that we've just talked about provide a good rationale. So again, treatment efficacy and safety, lots of new drugs in the space as we entered 2022 and 2023, multiple different ways of using those drugs that impacted sort of how treatment strategy baseline testing may have dropped. And then finally, the guidance, you can see there's confusion around the guidance there. And I think even, and you can talk to this better, I think even if you look at, even if you talk to the experts who put together the guideline documents, they are kind of apologetic about how those guidelines were developed. Again, it's about what the strength of the data is rather than telling people what to do, which is really what I feel like we need from guidelines.
Yeah, and I would say that was even further evidenced in a symposium that I had chaired several weeks ago, where our panelists include the CEO of Prime Therapeutics, the prior CMO of Centene, and the vice president of Walgreens of Specialty. When we were reviewing what are some of the challenges in regards to access and why is there so many differences in regards to which drug is approved for which formulary, et cetera, it really was put back on us of that we had give guidance around what the strength of the evidence was, but we did not give guidance on what is the clinical pathways we should be taking. And so really we've established a care gap that allows for others to put in their own interpretations, which aren't going to be the same throughout. And so that again adds to why you see this variability, why you see this dysfunction in regards to the treatment landscape that only introduces, again, the ability for us to be able to move forward with a much more specified outcome in regards to how we provide this education, and more broadly for myself, who does work a part of these academies, how do we construct the guidelines and consensus to be able to create a better opportunity to provide consistent education and care.
Yeah. So I just wanted to comment now. I'm quite surprised that we haven't seen any questions. So guys, please, if you're interested and you want to know more and you think that there's something to add to our data, we'd love to hear from you, because I think there's a lot to unpack here with these data. So, if you have questions or if you have something to contribute to what we've said, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Even if somebody says, yay, I'm here, because maybe there's nobody listening to this program.
So we do have a question that came in on the Horizon CME text line. So here's the question. This is from an earlier question. But here's another question we have. So okay, these data all look very interesting, but what is the takeaway for providers who aren't creating education in sleep medicine, but do create education that has serial learning like this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that this is unique to sleep education. What you're seeing here is it doesn't matter whether or not you're in oncology or you're in cardiology or you're anywhere else. Your intentions are always going to be, how do I actually create education that is justifying a behavior change? And so as a distinguished educator within our Academy of Educators at my institution and a professor, I am constantly challenged with having to educate and drive behavior change. One of the biggest challenges that CME has is that anytime that there is a change in the expected behavior change due to new guidelines, that we generally are not seeing that being effective for almost 10 years in a clinical practice. And we continue to see this be a major driver of less than adequate outcomes. The pieces that you can utilize this type of serial education for is to be able to illustrate those same pieces. So if your goal is to say, I need to drive at a practice change of diagnosis, therapeutic interventions, or some other strategy, the same type of assessment would be able to be utilized, and you'd be able to package it by who is your expected learners. Is it your top tier learners of, I want the cardiologist, and my second tier learners of my primary care? Understanding the differences in those profiles can also help you to be able to partner with whoever it is that's your supporter for those activities to understand the specifics that are needed for that target audience.
I think I'd like to add something here. I think that even, as providers and, as supporters, I think we're all challenged, whether, supporters internally to explain why they bother to support education. This has been a challenge for us for many, many years. Like, how do I justify the cost of education? And I think that this kind of analysis really does show that you're seeing improvements over time. Not all the time, but hopefully most of the time. And, understanding your environment also helps you to explain why potentially these changes are not huge, or why these changes, or why your baseline data are so low by comparison to things that you may not see in the sleep world. So I think that that's kind of the message we're trying to get across here, that we can use our data to justify why we're doing this kind of education. We can use the environment to explain why potentially we're not seeing the kind of changes in education that we'd like to see, with all the caveats that, again, people are not living in a vacuum. We're not the only thing that's providing education to them. And thirdly, I think that we'll come to claims data in a little bit, but if you have access to those kind of data, to really assess whether over time, whether it's your input or the input of multiple other things that are happening in the environment, particularly to the interested learner, will change the way that the interested learner behaves.
So we have one more question that just came in on the Horizon CME text line. And I don't think you're getting, I don't remember seeing a slide on this. So maybe this will be, you can talk to it now or a little bit later. Have you published this information? And if not, where do you think this information would best be disseminated to the CME industry and the medical, I guess the medical world as a whole?
And do you want to start?
So this information has not yet been published. Again, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to continue to dig even deeper into what the patterns are. What the data is really giving us is an illustration of what kind of behaviors are required to actually change clinical practice. And this has application to medical school, residency, fellowship training, as well as clinical practice. The places that this type of information could very well be impactful in, not only is in graduate medical education, however, is the type of thing that could be influential, especially when you're looking later on at the claims data in something like a Harvard Business Review, because you do want the people who are in the C-suite executives to be able to understand, you're seeing this pattern, you want this leapfrog score, you want this whatever type of denotation of a clinical center of excellence. This is something that you need to do. And so as a leader of a division, one of the things that is critically important is I can make clinical pathways all day, But if I don't have a way of disseminating and then assessing the adherence to them, then I'm not going to actually make the impactful clinical change that's necessary to drive up best outcomes. And essentially, you're looking at data that is going to be very influential, especially in an era of value-based outcomes being the measure of success, as well as financial return on investment. And so this type of data is very well positioned to not only live within graduate medical education for the feel goods of that, we've changed behaviors and we've been able to educate, but has a much more far-reaching impact in regards to really healthcare, the potential for impact on healthcare economics.
Emily, I think that you would probably want to add sort of where you think this might help us as kind of CME professionals. Where do you think this data could potentially live so that other people could learn from it and sort of the stuff that we've been trying to implement?
I think a future white paper or journal would be great. I do have other analyses and maybe a different design method that we can implement in the future based on, you know, our learnings from this initial analysis. And we're definitely going to talk about that at some later slides here about what that might look like. But yeah, I definitely think that this can be disseminated to a larger audience because there's some valuable insights in here as far as the landscape goes.
Yeah, we don't have this as a polling question, but, you know, I'm curious to hear from those of you that are participating in this program, whether you think you find these data valuable, you know, whether you think that they can be useful, not specifically in the context of a sleep program, but in our education in general. When you're educating year on year, do you think that it's a useful that what we've presented here is useful for you? So in other words, do you think you'd like to see it in a poster at one of our, you know, industry meetings? Do you think you'd like to see a journal article about it? And, you know, we have the chat. So if anybody has it, you know, can chime in on the chat function and let us know if you have any thoughts about that, you know, whether you think this is useful to you. And, you know, we'd also love to hear from, you know, our pharma supporters, as well as, you know, any providers like us out there.
Yeah, and I would just say, to add on to that, that in regards to what could be published, it's more than publishing on a specific data. There's the ability to publish on the framework that is being suggested, right? And that is reflective of the question I was asked: is beyond sleep, how can this information be utilized? Yeah. And really, what you're presenting today is a framework of analysis that can become a standard of impact and behavior change, and that can be layered in so many different ways. One of the things I've been very fortunate to experience being a part of a healthcare institute that is extraordinarily innovative and constantly is leading the edge in terms of digital transformation innovations and really education in general, is that we are very well known for creating the playbooks. We create playbooks for a variety of different novel, innovative ways to deliver care. And essentially, this is a framework and a playbook that can be replicated to be able to drive at standardizing what does success actually look like.
Right. And you know, there were limitations, and we're going to talk about them at the end, and we're going to talk about how we could have done things a little bit differently. But let's move into the final series of data that we wanted to present.
We really wanted to take a look at serial learning compared to, you know, a singular activity. We had hypothesized that, you know, a serial learner would show stronger improvements than those learners who just attended a single activity. Due to sample size limitations, we did look at learners who participated in 2 or more activities versus learners who participated in a single activity. But, you know, if we had a larger sample size, I think it would be really interesting to look at, you know, how learners who participated in 4 or more compared to learners that did 2 to 3. I think that would be really interesting analysis to look at in the future as well. Again, sample size, we couldn't do it this time around, but future, hopefully. So yeah, basically we saw those increases were more substantial for those who participated in more than one. So our hypothesis was correct in this instance.
Yeah, and I think that one of the pieces that I would also just kind of give the prelude to is stay tuned, because even more impactful does come when you complement this type of data with the claims data.
Right. All right, so looking at the year-by-year comparison again, we looked at the serial learners versus single activity learners, and it showed a higher pre and post across all 3 years in treatment strategy with a really, really nice jump, especially in 2024. Now, interestingly, we didn't see that same trend in 2024 for treatment safety and efficacy. And I'm kind of going to turn it back over to our experts, Jackie and Ann. Do you want to hypothesize as to what might have happened there, maybe in the treatment landscape that might be able to infer some kind of explanation there?
Yeah, so I'm going to start off by saying again, we all know this is not an exact science. We all live, again, no education in a vacuum. There's a lot of other things coming at these learners. It could be that, we would speculate that some of the learners that are taking more activities are really more interested in learning about sleep medicine. And so you would expect them to see higher jumps, or learning about narcolepsy. So you would expect to see higher jumps. But, again, it could have been, that when that particular activity was produced, the medical director was tougher and asked tougher questions. So again, because we don't have multiple questions in each activity, which, wouldn't we all love to put 10 pre-test questions in so that we can really get great outcomes data, but we can't do that. So, it's very difficult to speculate, but I think there are a number of reasons why we're not seeing that. And it's hard to know which one it is. I do think that if you guys have some ideas and you want to, potentially account for the fact that, why we're seeing relatively flat sort of treatment efficacy and safety information, let us know. The one thing that I can say is I think that, if you consider that strategy is more of a competence-based measurement, and efficacy and safety is more of a knowledge-based measurement, I think that sometimes we actually do see a bump in competence before we see a bump in knowledge. And that's because people are learning from other people what they're supposed to do rather than why they're supposed to do it. And so that might be some of the reason we're seeing that huge competence bump. Anne, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I would just add to 2024 was the year of emerging new therapies. We're seeing orexin agonists entering into phase 2 and phase 3 studies. We're seeing that tirzepatide was competing in terms of educational information becoming available with the Eli Lilly study for obstructive sleep apnea. So I think really what you're seeing here is that the design of many of the educational efforts that were being supported were really focused on treatment strategy. How do you identify the right phenotype of the patient, recognizing the limitations, because people really started coming to attention of realizing that there are limitations in these guidelines. And that had boiled up not only because of the limitations in the guidelines, but the high discrepancy across insurers and what the approvals are. So what you were really seeing are people who are frustrated in clinical practice trying to find a solution for their day-to-day strategy. And I can speak to that very specifically because not only as being a part of dedicated CME from like a Haymarket side, I also speak very widely at national and international conferences on these types of topics. And every single time, the questions that are the leading questions are around how do you choose? How do you manipulate this? How do you get the insurance to approve? So the treatment strategy is what people are coming for. And especially if they're repeat sleep learners, they're going to be even further incentivized because they've already learned some of this stuff from other things. They really are probably focusing more so in this particular area.
Any other comments, anybody? Okay, let's move on.
All right. The last comparison that we really wanted to look at between repeat sleep learners and single activity sleep learners was their confidence levels. And during these timeframes, they self-assessed themselves as somewhat confident at baseline across all 3 years, with very similar improvements, with the exception of a slightly higher net improvement for serial learners in 2023. Now, it's interesting that they are all kind of along the lines of not really confident, moving towards confident, but still at baseline somewhat confident, which arguably it's easier to educate those learners that aren't overly confident and they seem to know that they don't know everything. So in that instance, it's kind of like a wonderful thing for us.
Yeah. I mean, this is pretty flat. the interesting thing for me, I guess, was the higher gains in 2023, when actually we saw that those were the places where they knew the least about, their knowledge and competence was actually the lowest. So, I mean, I think that, subjective and objective testing obviously doesn't always correlate. We'd love it to, but it doesn't always. So, Anne, any other thoughts there?
Well, I think that when talking about the education landscape, you generally are reflecting on the Dunning-Kruger effect of who are your learners. And so very frequently, we always talk about how our interns may be our highest risk learners because they can be overly confident, but they have a huge gap in education. And so sometimes those are the ones where you're like, I really need to wrangle you in. And so when I do see that there may be lower confidence, there is also the question of, what is their degree of knowledge, and are they lacking the confidence in the information they already have? And if you're lacking confidence in information you already have that you should be confident in, it makes it a little bit more challenging to be able to say, this is the next phase learning that you should have. And so a part of this, I would say lessons learned as a part of this, is to be able to also provide activities that give that active positive reinforcement that you are getting the right things as you're going. One of the educational strategies that I very commonly utilize just when I'm rounding with my residents is really using questions to get at where are the gaps. And being able to use that positive reinforcement of, you got that right, you got that right, you got that right. This is our opportunity to learn something different. Okay, let's talk about this. I'm going to ask you about it again tomorrow. And I think this is where you're going to see that repeated activities do become very important. However, we do need to be able to better incorporate this strategy of positive reinforcement for the things you should be confident in and that you do already know.
All right.
Okay, moving on.
So we have one comment and one question that I'll throw out there. So the comment is, someone said that their organization is also delving into this research criteria, and this is similar into what we are looking at in terms of outcomes. So I guess that should just kind of substantiate that this is kind of something that is being done across the CME arena. And so our question is, I know that this program had 7 activities. How many activities would you recommend as necessary to do a serial learning outcomes analysis?
So Scott, I just want to point out firstly that this was not a program or a program with 7 activities. This was a series of 7 activities that were done from 2022 to 2024, different activities with similar themes, which is why we could group them. But they were not one program. So this was not a curriculum-based activity. This was us just looking retrospectively at a number of activities that we had done previously.
Yeah, so I think the question is, you
How
had
many?
7 individual activities. How many
many
activities do you need to be able to do this sort of analysis?
I don't want to pinpoint a number of specific activities. It's mostly going to be revolving around how many learners you were able to get into those activities to have a significant sample size to be able to work with the data. Now that's why I really don't want to put a number on activities. It's going to be more of a number of learners and how many learners you were able to get in through a pre-test, a post-test, to be able to assess all of these measures, make sure they answered, enough questions in each theme group that you have targeted here that you want to assess, the confidence, the intent to change. Maybe you want to look at barriers, just enough data that you have enough to be able to parse things out. Like, for example, in this instance, not only did we narrow it down to, your intended audience, but then you're also looking at single activities within that sleep audience, and then also repeat. So you have to adjust for, the level of specificity that you want to look into. So as long as you're accounting for all of the layers that you want in your analysis, all of those things should be a factor. So I don't want to give you a number because it really depends upon the level of specificity that you want to nail down to.
Can I just add to that? I think that it really depends on what you're looking for. So with that stated, you could have 2 activities and maybe you don't have a large volume, but what you're really looking at is a trend of what is the number of minutes participated in, what are the number of questions answered correctly. When you're looking at the different types of study design, it really is a matter of, is this kind of a pilot feature? Is this something that is already well established? You then can really take the same approach as to, am I doing quality improvement or am I doing true research? And when we're doing true research, we generally are saying, what is the power that I need in order to demonstrate the statistical significance? However, sometimes that's not feasible. And so therefore you can still do the analysis, and understanding, again, directionality becomes really relevant, because you may want to consider that, because that directionality, if it's going in the wrong way, you may then need to make the assessment is it too early for me to understand this, and recognizing that some people's performance goes down before it goes up? Or do we stick with this and then we are able to demonstrate that there's a benefit? So it allows you to actually have data to say, do we need to pivot versus do we need to go forward? Now, the second point that I would actually make is in addition to that consideration, is are you taking similar type of content and doing this analysis, versus are you doing some form of a microlearning or curriculum experience? And when you compare the two, do you see a different level of return on investment? And so I do think that those are very unique considerations. I do think if you're doing a micro learning experience where you're trying to capitalize on a singular content, not that it's micro learning of one thing and then another thing and then another thing within the same spectrum, you won't be able to show the movement that you like. But if it's, I'm only going to look at dosing or recommendations around dosing or something like that, I have 3 different activities, then that potentially could be enough just for you to understand what is the value of that singular product.
But I think the take-home message here is repetition is key. And I think we have to keep that in mind. So, that really does speak a little bit to how we design programs moving forward. To Anne's point, yes, sometimes we do a series of 4 activities, but there's no repetition in them.
Exactly.
Is it worthwhile going back and saying, you learned this in the previous program, and we'll re-emphasize those points. Now let's talk about this. So, keeping that in mind, I think, is an important learning point for all of us.
Yeah.
Okay.
The moment you've all been waiting for. How does it translate to performance? Diving into our claims data, our sleep learners indicated increases of narcolepsy diagnoses by 67% by the serial learners versus 40% from these single activity learners, and an increase of 17% in prescriptions compared to a 17% decrease by a single activity learner group. So I'm going to turf this back over to Jackie and Anne for their insights on how the landscape kind of explains what we're seeing here. But I think it speaks very strongly for the argument of, serial learning really does have a larger impact here.
I mean, I do want to point out, Emily and Leanne are sitting in front of you. And really, they are the two that really look at all of our data. We do have a really wonderful mechanized back-end system that was developed by our internal technology team that really does pull some of these data out. But, they are the ones that put together all our outcomes reports, et cetera. And so, as we've mentioned, doing something like this is very time. It takes up a lot of time and takes up a lot of their time that they potentially don't have. But, for our database team, I mean, we do have a huge team in the background that support us unconditionally and have really been incredible in getting this type of information to us. So I just want to kind of do a shout out to them.
Yes,
because pulling these data from databases seems so easy, because I'm like, well, why can't you just ask the database this question and it, pumps it out? It doesn't work like that. We've learned. So getting this type of information can take days and days and days of working with the system. So we really appreciate that. That's the first thing. Second thing, I really appreciate our outcomes team for working so hard to get this information out and then helping us to understand what it all means. And then, kind of in looking at these data, I mean, I think it pretty clearly tells us that repetition is very important. And, again, thank you to Anne for bringing that up when we looked at these data originally, and say, so that we could actually take a good look at this and say, those that took only one activity really didn't do that well. And now I guess we have to speculate why. So, Anne, do you want to talk to that?
Sure. So first, before I speculate why, I just want to build on the point that you just mentioned, is that when this data was initially presented to me, the lateral side of the page where it has the single and repeat activities was not presented to me. It was just the 1%. And my knee-jerk reaction was like, this makes no sense. This is garbage, right? And it wasn't. And I, at the end of the meeting, I was like, I hope I wasn't mean to you guys. That wasn't. It was my research brain just automatically kicked in. And so this really goes back to saying it is a science to do education. Okay, it is a true science. This is the reason why there's bachelor degrees and master's degrees and doctoral degrees around education. And it's also a science to know who your audience is. And if you start a educational effort without knowing who your audience is, or you want to analyze your outcomes without knowing who your audience is, you will miss what it is that you've accomplished. And so what you're seeing here is substantially important, because when we're looking at that earlier data and you're going, I don't really know why there wasn't that much of a change in diagnosis in terms of the confidence. Well, we did see that people had better treatment strategy. Well, we did see better treatment strategy. We saw that people were likely more appropriately prescribing medications when they were getting repeated education. We saw that although they didn't acknowledge that their diagnosis has improved, we're seeing that they're diagnosing more people. And so this is not new information, people. We know that repetition is key in education, and many times having to deliver it in multimodal ways to be able to meet your learner based on how it is that they're learning. In adult learning, there is very frequently the difference of not only what type of learning experience is best for them, but also it depends on the content, because what their learning experience might be, whether it's a podcast or audiovisual or with some sort of gamification, it all can change based on what they can do. And one of the things I would say that I've been very fortunate with is being able to see these types of outcomes are only driving at why the design of the education that we do is always looking at how do we move the needle in regards to making it more multimodal and trying to meet more learners' needs, but also re-engaging the same people who have already done some activities, because you're going to see the highest return on investment overall. And as an ecosystem, everyone wins.
All right. So the next question that everyone's going to ask is, where do we go from here? So essentially we were trying to figure out, what kind of future analyses we really wanted to dive into, what takeaways we had based on, the learnings that we found when we were doing this analysis. And what we really kind of ended up with was, this is a very retroactive design. If we had our way, we have a very proactive design where we are able to, say and kind of promote this in the very beginning, where we have established there are enough questions for every theme that that we want to measure, that the intent to change question, does it align with what we're seeing in our performance? Does answering that kind of like as a self-assessment truly, relate down to what they're actually doing in their practice? So questions like that we really want to dive into. And then also from a marketing perspective, if we're able to push our learners through a curriculum rather than having them market per activity, I think that might be another interesting factor to look at as well. Jackie, do you have any other benefits there for the proactive approach?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that, again, we had done a series of online programs. So basically what we said is, let's see if what we did retroactively made any difference to the learners. And so, if we were to design a more proactive, say, let's say curriculum, the first thing that we would do is we would get our marketing team involved, and we would say, okay, everyone who goes into one activity, the activity needs to be promoted to them again. They need to be recruited into the second activity. We need to potentially, really make sure that we're getting a much larger audience going through multiple activities. And, I can give you an example of that, even a series of activities that we did recently where we didn't actually expressly market to people to come to multiple activities. But what we did is we linked the activities to one another. So as soon as they saw one activity, they were linked to the other activities. And we saw from that program, Emily, help me with the numbers again, please. I think
it was a series of 5 sleep programs, and we ended up having 1/5. So 20% of all our overall learners went to all 5 of them.
Yeah, and so we saw like 49% went to more than one activity. So without even this interactive marketing, this specific recruitment of multiple people to come back into activities, we saw that change. So we would want to do that. Obviously, it would be really nice if we could look at subjective performance data. We didn't have enough because a lot of the activities that we're looking at are still in 2024. So it would be nice to look at that. Obviously, our limitations in sample size. I would love to know, as Emily has pointed out numerous times, whether people who took 4 activities did better than those that took 2. And so, Scott, you popped up, so you have a question, and then we'll cover the last item.
Yeah, so I was just popping up because we're just about out of time. So I just wanted to just if you guys can kind of wrap things up, that would be great.
Yeah. So, I think that it's also important. I think that understanding the therapeutic landscape. So, using our medical staff internally who have experience and an understanding of the environment, plus, incredible advisors like Anne who will point out to us nuances that are happening in the therapeutic environment really help us to interpret these data. And I think that's very important from the perspective of being able to, whether we're providers talk to supporters or whether as supporters you have to explain internally why you're seeing the kind of data that you are.
All right, great. So we did have someone who asked if they could contact you for more information. So that information is on this slide. People can also just go to our fall agenda page, and we have links to both your LinkedIn pages, so they can probably contact you through there. So very quickly, before we wrap things up, there is a brief CME Palooza Fall survey at the bottom of the live tab that we're hoping people can go through and answer. And this is the last session. So last session of the day. So there are no more sessions of CME Palooza Fall. So with that, I am going to bring Derek very quickly up on the screen to offer his words of wisdom that he has been waiting for all day as we wrap up 10 years of CME Palooza today.
Viewership numbers just skyrocketed as I came on to the... Thank you to everyone for participating today. A lot of great sessions, a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. 10 years down, or 11 years down. 10th anniversary, 11 years down.
Yeah, that's
right.
true.
Right. Yeah.
Great. Words of wisdom, just as prophetic as always, Derek. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So thank you to this panel, to Jackie and to Emily and to Leanne and to Dr. Morse. And thank you for everybody who joined us today. And we will see you in 2025.
Yeesh. See everybody.
All right. We are officially out.